She received her PhD in political science from Northwestern University and an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown University. Rana's research interests include contention, displacement, and humanitarianism in the Middle East, as well as qualitative and multi-method research. And as I was telling folks on the way up here, Rana does big qualitative and big quantitative. It's like a very rare combination to have a scholar that has done such in-depth work when it comes to interviewing and observations in Arabic in another country, and then also even innovating qualitative methods, as you can see through one of her articles on respondent-driven sampling about accessing hard-to-reach populations that are vulnerable and also creating generalizable data based on that work. So very CSDE for us to try to bring the two together and to focus on methods. Back to the official bio, her research has been published in Perspectives on Politics, World Development, Middle East Law and Governance, and Forced Migration Review. And then today she is presenting her new book that just came out with Cornell University Press, Civilizing, Contention, International Aid in Syria's War. So please join me in welcoming Rana Khoury.
Thank you so much, Rowan, for that extremely generous introduction. All the things that Rowan said about me, I feel this very same about her. So thank you to CSDE, Jessica, Maddie Ferris. Thank you to the Middle East Center, Rowan, Arya Fenny, Samira, thank you, and Nick, as well as the Population Health Initiative. I'm very, very pleased to be here. So thank you so much for having me. How am I doing with microphone in the back? Would you like me to use the microphone? Okay. Okay. Please just interrupt if you change your mind. So Ahmed grew up in Daraa, a bucolic province in southern Syria. His mother, like others in their agricultural town, encouraged him to study. So after high school, Ahmed moved to the heart of it all, Damascus, to pursue a technical business degree. And while there, he saw more money, development, and cars than he ever had. Exposed to inequality, Ahmed began to think about politics. Mandatory, grueling military service deepened his thinking. The severe institution seemed to spare only those with connections. So after these stints in the city and army, he eagerly returned to a cleaner life in the countryside. Ahmed was working 2 jobs to support his new wife and budding family when the Syrian uprising began in March 2011. He joined his town's first demonstration alongside just 15 others who dared to defy the ruthless Assad regime. As he put it, us youth, we were taking to the streets against oppression. Security forces showed up and the protesters went home. But that night, hundreds in the town came out. And for Ahmed, it was a revelation. He and a group of trusted friends began coordinating their contentious actions, even as he developed a sense that a long road lay ahead. Most Syrians lacked experience in democratic participation and independent organizing. Still, Ahmed was shocked the first time he saw a protester injured and bleeding. I didn't expect the army would actually shoot us, he recalled. Still, he persisted. Within the coordinating committee, Ahmed was tasked with documenting events and disseminating footage to raise awareness of the movement and the repression that it faced. And although he was new at this, he progressed from sending cell phone videos to a contact in Jordan to producing direct broadcasts for international TV stations like Al Jazeera. Another group of Darawis, people from Daraa, was coordinating the efforts of local committees across the province that helped organizers like Ahmed acquire information such as the location of army checkpoints. The protests continued for months, and in the beginning, Ahmed asserts they were not sectarian. The Islamists and extremists, he says, came later. When the opposition movement took up arms, initially in self-defense, Ahmed remained committed. If you were on the side of the demonstrations, you also had to be on the side of the army, he said. So he joined a Free Syrian Army rebel unit as media coordinator, carrying weapons for his protection. A few months in, however, he was disappointed. The rebels weren't upholding the liberal ideals that had originally motivated the movement. He laid down his arms. But Ahmed continued to act on behalf of the cause. He converted his house to a shelter for activists. A tile in his floor served as the opening to an underground hiding place that could fit a dozen people. This was risky, but it maintained his influence in the movement while he considered his next move. In a town surrounded physically by armed groups and ideologically by burgeoning Islamist currents, Ahmed had ruled out participation in armed rebellion, but he wasn't ready to stop participating altogether. During war, civil activists confront hard choices under harder circumstances. Government repression can quash protest. Individuals can rule out the use of violence, and collective exhaustion can undo a social movement. As options for nonviolent action narrow, risks grow. Cleavages harden, territories divided, and armed actors target real and perceived opponents. The odds are stacked against people like Ahmed. Indeed, a common narrative tells us that Syria's social movement failed and violence prevailed. An encyclopedia entry captures this. According to Britannica, the regime's harsh military crackdown escalated tensions, and by September 2011, the peaceful protests had become an armed insurgency. So this book challenges that narrative. While some activists did join the insurgency and others did capitulate to the repression, many others embarked on wartime activism. In the depths of war and without experience, Syrians founded countless organizations to advocate for detainee rights, document daily events, distribute public goods, deliver emergency relief, provide psychosocial support to children, and so on. In short, something like a civil society emerged during Syria's war. How did this happen? With what resources? In which areas? And to what ends? Perhaps one explanation for the surge in civil organization is that these novel forms of nonviolent action were relatively safe compared to the mass protests that make for easy targeting. But existing research shows that Syrians who engaged in post-protest activism were also detained, violently targeted, or forcibly displaced throughout the war. Even the humanitarians were not spared. The Syrian regime, according to Physicians for Human Rights, strategically targeted health facilities and health workers and branded health workers as enemies of the state. Indeed, Syria became one of the deadliest places for aid workers in the world at the height of its civil war, according to another international humanitarian organization. So why did militarization not quell activism altogether? How did nonviolent action persist alongside the violent offshoots of the anti-regime movement? And how did activists remain engaged even in neighboring countries, despite the precarity of forced displacement? In this book, I argue that to give a satisfactory answer to these questions, we should look toward a common element of crisis contexts: international aid. International aid organizations arrived to help in and around Syria beginning in 2011 as the clashes between the regime and its opponents escalated. In the decade that followed, hundreds of thousands perished, while millions fled internally and to neighboring countries as the war wrought unfathomable destruction on the country. The Syrian regime blocked aid to rebellious regions, leading many international aid organizations to set up operations in neighboring countries, including Turkey and Jordan, in order to pursue their humanitarian and other objectives in areas outside government control. To execute cross-border aid operations from neighboring countries into rebel-held regions like Daraa, international actors would turn to locals like Ahmed. People like Ahmed, facing multiplying challenges and risks, would in turn find a way to participate in nonviolent action on behalf of the Syrian cause by working with and for international aid organizations. These convergences between international and local actors lead to the book's primary research question: how does international aid shape civil action in war? To answer it, I develop a framework to understand the interactions between international and local actors engaged in non-military action. And my framework applies when humanitarians and other non-military aid actors, such as those working in development and stabilization, have the autonomy to pursue their objectives and to do so relatively unhindered by state or non-state armed actors. Autonomy often exists in what conflict scholars call areas of limited statehood, like rebel-held territory. It also exists where states are strong, but not obstructive. So consider one fairly common configuration for aid autonomy, these cross-border operations. Aid organizations bypass obstructive central governments in the conflict state by working in border regions in cooperation with neighboring states and non-state armed groups. We've seen such a configuration into Ethiopia from Sudan in cooperation with Tigrayan rebel groups, into Nigeria's rebel-held Biafra region in cooperation with neighboring Sao Tome, into northern Iraq from Turkey and Iran, and so on. And it's what autonomous aid organizations do in these areas that implicates local actors, with whom they often work with and through to achieve their objectives. Humanitarians distribute goods, like food and tents. They provide services, like medical care and drinking water systems. And they promote rules, like those for child protection. Goods, services, and rules are the domains of governing authorities. Now, aid actors don't control the territory in areas of limited statehood the way rebels would, but they do engage in governance in that territory, if not over it. And it's under these conditions that aid in general and humanitarianism in particular enables local actors to participate in civil action while simultaneously constraining their political and collective character. So my argument proceeds in three parts that track with the institutional qualities of contemporary aid. Each of these is associated with a process that shapes contention into something quite different from the informal and transgressive action that characterized Ahmad's first uprising year. First, international aid actors forge relations with civil actors in conflict zones to enact their crisis responses. These linkages can create the means and opportunities for local actors to participate in the framework of crisis response, even when violence is pervasive. Second, aid organizations impose rules that establish authority over the response. These rules can equip local activists with technocratic skills that can be deployed to monitor and evaluate problems in their country, but not to transgress on the political structures that create them. And third, international humanitarians distribute resources based on needs, but also other imperatives. These resources can favor the most fit, legible, and legitimate local actors, while introducing new cleavages and hierarchies in a population of organization that itself grew in response to aid. International aid, through these three processes, enables and constrains local nonviolent action in war, shaping contention into a civilized population of organizations engaged in conflict processes. That is, in intervening in and imposing order on the parts of the conflict over which they can exert some influence, international aid organizations forge something like a civil society among local actors by supporting their active participation in particular ways. International aid, however, cannot protect civil society. Civil society is defined in relation to and needs the protection of a state. As a result, aid can also leave local activists bare to the violence that unfolds in war and its aftermath. Now, this framework can help explain how someone like Ahmed emerged from a kitchen floor foxhole to establish an educational organization in Daraa that lightened the hardships of hundreds of children, with the support of a managerial office staffed by his peers who had taken refuge across the border in Jordan. Then Ahmed worked to advance good governance in his town, bringing in significant service programs like street cleaning. As he learned to adhere to stringent accounting protocols, Ahmed was also engendering the distrust of local leaders and the disdain of Islamist organizations. He had to battle accusations of secularism, escape shelling and armed clashes, and combat his own guilt about earning a comfortable salary amid suffering. All concerns he shared with me during one of his capacity building trainings in Jordan. Savvy and irrepressibly likable, Ahmed earned and maintained grassroots community support to continuously pursue his goals until the Syrian armed forces reclaimed control of Daraa in 2018, and all that civil action came to an end. The book's theoretical framework, I hope, improves our understanding of how civilians and refugees engage in activism, nonviolent action taken to bring change to the lives of others, as defined by Bayat, during war and despite violent targeting, generalized insecurity and displacement, and crises of resource-intensive needs. Now, scholars have studied how international aid affects violent action in war and how it affects nonviolent action in peaceful or post-conflict contexts. This project considers these interactions during war in the domain of nonviolence, but it offers more than a change in scenery. This process-based theory of civilizing contention answers lingering questions in existing research. For example, the idea of NGOization suggests that material incentives offered by outsiders sever good local movements from their grassroots. But it's not a given that international organizations cause harm despite their objectives, nor is it obvious why activists would repeatedly opt into processes that lead them away from their original missions. Instead, acknowledging the needs of communities in conflict, as well as the risks undertaken by activists to serve them, should disabuse us of the idea that wartime activists lose their attachments to the grassroots. At the same time, this framework also identifies the power of aid to inflect local activism, even under the direst of circumstances. This framework also helps us better understand real-world processes that unfold during war, including how local activists assume risks that international aid workers won't to feed and shelter hundreds of thousands and even millions of people, how rebels govern with or beside civilian counterparts, how events on the ground are documented when international media lack access, how activists who have been displaced become remote managers of their counterparts in rebel-held territory, implementing international projects, and what comes of social movements when contention escalates into conflict. On this last point, one of the book's main goals is to enhance our understanding of wartime activism, a term I'm using interchangeably with civil action and nonviolent action. And to this end, I build on ideas in civil war studies that take civilians as people with politics and agency that can persist and transform during war, and connect this to work on forced migration that identifies the ways refugees act as agents who can also uplift their communities, including those across the border in the civil war state. These insights on civil action are put into conversation with ideas about social movement cycles and demobilization to reveal how nonviolent and violent contention can coincide during war. Social movements may have afterlives in war that we miss altogether when we don't pay attention to the forms and motivations of wartime activism and the civil actors involved, many of whom may have fled into refuge. Indeed, border regions can comprise subsystems of conflict processes where local, refugee, regional, international actors pursue political, diplomatic, humanitarian, development, and other objectives. Such bustling border areas have emerged across the border from southern Sudan and Kenya, where international aid organizations worked with local activists and rebel groups to provide relief during the Sudanese civil war. In the border regions between Tunisia and Libya during the Libyan uprising and war. In Algeria, across from Moroccan-controlled Western Sahara, where an entire non-governmental government has risen and gained international support. In Nepal, where Bhutanese activists forged an ecosystem of exile politics and demanding rights from their nearby home state. And in the border regions between Myanmar and Thailand, where nonviolent activists, non-state armed groups, and international aid actors have pursued their goals for decades. From Afghanistan and Pakistan to Ukraine and Poland, the phenomenon of civil actors among both refugees and civilians is common, if strikingly underexplained. And time and again, international aid organizations are in these regions. And they matter because they insert material resources into conflict contexts. But their influence goes beyond the provision of raw assistance. They also matter because, as Barnett has explained, they hold constitutive power over social actors. That means they can shape the capacities and interests of those over whom they hold power. They can affect who engages in crisis response, in which ways, for which beneficiaries, toward what ends, with whom, and to whose advantage, all while filling in Excel sheets at their computers and professing principles like neutrality. International aid actors, due to logistical and operational needs and sometimes localization and participatory objectives, often engage local actors in their undertakings. And some scholars promote such international local engagement as normatively and practically desirable for intervention. They contend that local actors can be key to the success of international actors seeking to resolve conflict and build peace. Perhaps, but those interactions will have changed them. So how do I study this? I adopt an analytic approach that foregrounds causes, mechanisms, and interpretation. First, I start with the case and outcome I seek to explain and move backward toward the causes. The outcome and case here are something like a civil society in Syria's war, and the causes I've identified are the institutional characteristics of international aid. Second, I infer mechanisms or the pathways leading from cause to effect. And third, interpretation allows me to understand what matters in these international local interactions in war and the often subtle ways that they unfold through the meanings that involved actors attribute to them. To uncover and infer these meaning-laden causal processes, I undertake process tracing, or the examination of evidence within a case to infer the processes that explain it, with attention to sequence and to arbitrating of evidence of complementary or alternative explanations. While so doing, I leverage variation in aid autonomy to explore differing causal pathways. Aid to Syria varied across space, reflecting territorial control, patterns of contention, and the politics of refugee host states. To wit, international actors enjoyed substantial autonomy for a significant stretch of the war in Turkey and indirectly across the border into northwest Syria. They had relatively less autonomy in Jordan and indirectly across the border into southern Syria. For the fine-grained empirical detail critical to process tracing, I rely primarily on field-based research in Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon, where I conducted nearly 150 interviews with Syrians and international aid workers over 10 months in multiple trips from 2014 to 2017, and where I shadowed and lived with American staff and with Syrian refugees engaged in elements of the international response and in activism. And through immersive observation, I learned of the everyday elements of life and work in what Otaser calls Peaceland, inhabited by the transnational community of interveners, which in this story is inhabited by local actors as well. I also draw on an original data set of public Facebook pages of Syrian organizations that I constructed after building the foundations of my theory to evaluate at a large scale some of its observable implications. The nearly 1,400 pages included are outward-facing representations of formal and informal organizations of Syrians in the country, in refugee-receiving states, and in the wider diaspora. They include community-based, faith-based, and non-governmental organizations, as well as coordination committees, opposition governance bodies, media outlets, art collectives, human rights advocates, and so forth. Finally, I draw extensively on the databases and the many, many reports of international aid organizations for evidence of the funds, projects, and locations associated with their response to the war in Syria. Let me preview for you some of the analyses. In the first empirical chapter on what I call the facilitating process, I consider how international actors established relations with local actors, despite the previous absence of such relations in Assad's Syria. International actors saw activists' potential to become crisis responders and afforded them the capacity to act as such. They lobbied world powers for a UN Security Council resolution to work cross-border, created mechanisms for local organizations to participate within, and within which their numbers ballooned. International aid organizations even pursued these relations in areas under intense government siege and shelling, and under the control of extremist rebel groups that targeted local activists, suggesting that nonviolent action persisted not only where structural conditions were conducive, but instead where local activists enjoyed relations with international actors. In the second empirical chapter on what I call a formalizing process, I analyze how international actors compel local activists to obey the rules of crisis response, despite their high risk and highly political context. This begins by demonstrating that Syrian activists were least political in those spaces we'd least expect it. In Turkey and northwest Syria, where the opposition to the Assad regime was most pronounced. This puzzle, too, is resolved by accounting for the role of international aid actors, who were focusing civil activist efforts on producing and provisioning knowledge for the response, engaging in what one activist condemned as nonstop data collection. In the third empirical chapter on what I call a filtering process, I demonstrate that the growth rate of civil organizations rose and fell in sync with the international resource environment. But resources weren't only material. They were also ideational, or based on ideas of what makes a good local partner. I interpreted these ideas by listening to what Parkinson calls money talk, which was often sensitive, but sometimes loud, when aid incentivized compromises to physical safety, such as when activists were pushed to counter violent extremism in the scramble for funds and favor. In another chapter, I take the theory to other conflicts around the world to assess how it travels, and also consider a dramatic case of no aid back in Syria, in that territory held by the Islamic State. Okay, so what does it all mean now? Because there's been two major changes that transpired in the 2 months after I submitted the final draft to Cornell. So on December 8th, 2024, the Syrian regime dissolved. President Bashar al-Assad, who in 2000 had inherited the country from his father, who had ruled since 1970, fled the country in the face of a surprise, decisive, and largely bloodless rebel offensive that lasted a mere 11 days. Since 2020, the fault lines of the Syrian civil war had been frozen. Imperfect ceasefires had maintained rebel control in the corners of the country, but the regime had seemed to emerge triumphant until it didn't. Hope is desperately felt in this moment of change, but the path forward is fraught. The challenges include reconstruction of destroyed infrastructure and divided society, hardliners within the government and its armed forces, well-founded fears among minorities, the impoverishment of a valuable people, and geopolitical rivalries and interventions in a region suffering acute and endemic instability. The task is to create a national project inclusive of an array of societal interests, but protective of individual rights, and to do so in an authoritarian region and in a world backsliding on democracy, while millions of refugees risk losing protection in their host countries, even as conditions for voluntary return remain uncertain. Civil society cannot fix all of this, but the assets of civil organizations built in crisis, the perseverance and experience of those nonviolent actors recounted in the book, hold the potential to at least mitigate them by holding power to account, advocating for inclusivity, and articulating grassroots demands, by applying their skills to issues of transitional justice, reconstruction, and representative institution building, and by helping serve the immense material needs in the country. It won't be easy. They were displaced or squeezed into rebel-held areas during the war. They'll need to work together and get confrontational at times. That is, they'll have to lean into the ways that aid enabled their growth and development over the years, but release themselves from the constraints it had imposed if they are to become a genuine civil society for the whole country. In this crucial moment, there's been a second profound change. the decline of international aid in general, and particularly the complete dismantling of the United States Agency for International Development. Giving tens of billions of dollars per year, the United States has for decades been the largest donor of international aid in the world, most of which went through USAID and which was exemplified in Syria, where humanitarian aid broke records. Now, if the fall of the Syrian regime had not coincided with the rise of Doge, I propose we would have been witnessing local and international organizations alike pouring into Syria in this moment, opening offices in Damascus and Aleppo, hiring experienced staff that have been based in neighboring Turkey and Jordan, now able to return to their homeland, and gearing up projects for post-conflict recovery and for receiving returning refugees. The new authorities would be viewing them with some mix of skepticism and intriguing potential for co-optation. But rather than pouring in, they're trickling. Local actors going it largely alone in uncertain waters. Indeed, we're seeing something unfold that this book is explicitly concerned with. Aid is impermanent, autonomy far from given. Aid comes and goes, and local activists stay, left with their something like, not quite, a civil society. The final concluding chapter takes us into these situations, including the areas where the regime reclaimed territorial control from rebels during the war, obstructed aid, forced activists to flee and organizations to disband, and deprived thousands of beneficiaries overnight. The civilized society that international aid had facilitated, formalized, and filtered lacked the state protection that civil society needs and was disappeared by the state instead. This is what happened to Ahmed. He fled Daraa when the regime regained control in 2018. He went first to Idlib, run then by the rebels now governing the whole of Syria. But he lacked the community ties that had protected him on the opposite side of the country. And so he fled to Turkey, where aid organizations were no longer enjoying the autonomy they once did. He fled again to Germany, where he gained asylum and entered the bureaucratic labyrinth that could reunite his family in safety. And it's there where he's now stuck, incomplete legal processes restricting his mobility in the very moment where he could be contributing to a new Syria, but for having been part of something like a civil society that was not part of a state. Syria's activists will have to be their own survivors and saviors without international aid in a context where strong men, private interests, and regional machinations can leave little space for civil action. Yet they've met the moment before, and Syria needs them to do it again. Thank you. Do you mind for all of you to introduce yourselves? Yeah, go.
I'm Schultz. I was curious.
Yeah.
I work at eScience Institute. It's a place here.
Okay.
I'm curious how old he was, because I feel like a lot of that youthful fervor naturally declines. Not to mention all the dynamics that changed from then to now when he's in Germany. And there's also pressure fatigue.
Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, how old was Ahmed when the uprising began in 2011? And whether that age sort of matters at this later point in time, particularly as people become fatigued or sort of move on with their lives, right? So let me think, how old would Ahmed have been? Maybe in his early 20s in 2011. And in fact, I did, so Rowan had earlier mentioned the survey using respondent-driven sampling that I did of Syrian activists in Jordan, which is not actually in the book. But in doing that, I sort of found what you might expect with the age and demographics of folks, right? These were people who were educated, although many Syrians were quite well educated to begin with. and who were youthful in the sense that they were maybe in their 20s or 30s. Although there was, depending on the type of work, that varied in bigger ways. Particularly in local governance institutions in rebel-held territory, that was often where sort of there was more voice for elders, right, and people who had more experience and professional experience. So one of the ideas that I'm trying to bring forth with this role that international aid, this decisive role, right, is because you can very easily imagine nonviolent activists become fatigued. I mean, how much repression can you take, in your social movement? So you go home and you try to figure out, I'm just going to take care of myself and my family. Right. And I actually think that in that moment when international aid came in was what sustained this activism for a much longer time than we might have otherwise seen. And so given the skill sets and given the experience that people like this have acquired, I think this is very much a moment where they can come and put it to work inside the country, from the capital, from the major cities where they were never allowed to operate previously. And so I, in following up with Ahmed as I'm putting together the book talk, that's not what's stopping him, because he's continued in this realm. He just lacks the mobility that displaced people lack, the legal mobility in this moment. Thank you. Jeff.
There's a question online, but I'm also going to capitalize on this opportunity to ask my own question. This isn't super well informed, but a lot of your talk was really right themes of part of Fanon's Direction of the Earth, and his drawing this line between the active part of violent resistance and then the next step of nation building. And obviously the contexts are a little bit different in Syria than in Algeria, but I mean, this whole book seems to be about the fact that it is not two distinct phases, but that there is this like attempt at nation building, maybe state building, and maybe there's some tension between what the idea of like national identity is versus the Syrian state, and where international organizations come in, how. Yeah, I don't know. I just want to hear a little bit more from that perspective about these different things that play. There's multiple goals going on, multiple factions of civil society and international society at the same time.
Yeah, that's a great question, and the first one I've gotten that invokes Fanon, so thank you. So I think you really have put your finger on exactly what was to repeat the question. I'm sorry, I forgot. So the question was, in sort of some existing critical theory that we have, for example, Fanon, resistance is thought of as sort of temporally prior to nation building. And the question here is that maybe these are actually not two sort of distinct processes, but things that are coinciding in time more. And I think every Syrian activist would agree with you. I think that was very much their vision, particularly as they were creating these sort of coordinating committees, eventually these local councils for sort of municipal level governance. And this is in a context where the state had a very significant presence in people's lives. A model like the Ba'ath regime in Syria, where part of the ideology that was put into practice was to really extend the state, right? And so the electrification, the literacy rates, what I mentioned earlier, Syrians were quite highly educated. There was a lot of presence of the state. And so it was very much the idea of we need to counter and show that we can do this too. But that is resource intensive. So again, I think, we need this to bring in these international organizations into view to better understand how can they pull this off. And I think it's shaped their experience, not just ideologically, but also quite physically, because it is, when there was shelling by the regime into rebel-held areas, people often interpreted and understood, and scholars have sort of gone in and found support for this, that civilian institutions that were making life work were targeted in particular, right? So going after bakeries, going after health institutions, medical centers, clinics. So these were perceived to be heavily targeted in direct response to the threat of that sort of counter state building that can happen even during war. I'm gonna just one more thing on that, because I think in conflict scholarship, we have come to understand that rebels do governance work, but I think what has still been missing there is, well, so do these civilians too, right alongside with them. And in fact, they often make it possible, because international actors, they're gonna be wary of working with rebels, but they'll work with these guys.
Mary, I don't know if you want to ask a question about the sort of the secondary goals. You don't know to ask. Oh, here you go. Sorry.
Hi, are you hearing me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Thank you, Rana. That was a really fantastic presentation, and I am excited to read this book, and it is so necessary at this moment. I have so many questions, but I will ask just the one, which is, I'm just curious, I guess because you spent some time at the end talking about how the shuttering of US aid has related to the slowing down of international aid to Syria. So I was just wondering if there are any non-Western sources of aid that you have observed, or any that might be coming. Maybe the answer is no, in which case that's the end of that question. But if there is, I'm curious what you think the future of that might look like now, and if you think that that might foster any different kinds or any specific kinds of civil society formations.
Yeah, thank you so much, Miriam. And do I need to repeat that, or that we're doing it for the Zoom, right? Okay. So the question of non-Western aid in this moment, but I actually, in the shuttering of USAID, but I actually want to also address it, if that's okay, during the conflict too, because non-Western aid was also present during the conflict. And especially early on, from let's say 2011 to 2013, there was a lot of support for both armed and unarmed action that was coming from diaspora networks, as well as from the Gulf and charities and even the governments in the Gulf region. And so that's something that I contend with in the book as well. But it's something that, in my observation, for one, as we might expect, there are organizations that are not necessarily following the humanitarian principles that many Western organizations would choose to follow. But more importantly, they lost interest or were eventually sort of exhausted, fatigued, or eventually, to the extent that they continued to see aid coming in from non-traditional donors, was just directed through these international mechanisms, right? So eventually what we're seeing is just the decline of non-traditional aid, or non-traditional aid going through traditional processes. So to bring that to this moment, this is something that the new Syrian authorities are betting on, have been very hoping for aid to be coming from non-traditional actors, particularly in the Gulf. And so to go back to how it might differ from some of the processes that international organizations would undertake, right? We can see the ways that it's geared often toward more luxury or high-end projects, right? Like with, Syria has a serious housing shortage, right? But when you see the proposals and the memorandums of understanding between Gulf financing and the new Syrian authorities, it's like for a luxury high rise that the people who need housing will never afford. And so I think this often is serving private interests, but more importantly, I think even that now is also seriously undermined by the latest conflict in the Middle East, where Gulf countries came under, their own sets of sources of strain, and governments like that of Saudi Arabia are cutting back on their own development projects, let alone sort of taking on this task of funding Syria's reconstruction. So I think there's a lot of need and not a lot of money. Okay, I will start with students. I'm like making assumptions and then we'll go to faculty. Yeah, go ahead. Okay. Okay. I realized as soon as I said it, I'm making assumptions.
Your work because I work on US and the Caribbean. I think about exile migration in the 19th century and work on questions of before and after the US Civil War and how people flow in and out of the country from the US and the Caribbean. And so for me, what I appreciate about your work is you mentioned two things: borderland studies, Civil War studies, explicitly, sometimes implicitly. And I suppose the question I have is, for research as a scientist, I think because of your interdisciplinary space, I'm one of the faculty affiliates here, really thinking about Civil War studies and what do you think your work contributed to organizing the Civil War as a concept. I think I'm exploring, for example, the idea of African Americans in the Civil War leading to the Caribbean or after that period. So thinking about the international context of Civil War. So I'm really curious what you learned on the ground, on a more local level, what have you learned about the nature of Civil War itself?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. So the question coming from a esteemed faculty member is about, thinking about Civil War studies and borderland studies with these parallels to the US Civil War and the ways that that affected mobility of African Americans between the US and the Caribbean, right? And so the question pointed at me is, what do I think I've contributed to Civil War studies? So I'd like to think a few things, but I think for one thing, I mean, the conflict studies in political science in particular has really sort of made impressive strides, I would say, in the last decade or two toward really looking through the black box, particularly in rebel-held territory, and not seeing it as just zones of chaos, right? Understanding to the extent that there's violence, understanding types of violence, different repertoires of violence, selective and discriminate and so forth, and also the other things that rebels are doing besides violence. And more recently, more and more attention is being paid to civilians. A lot of that has been sort of, how are civilians protecting themselves? Are they staying? Are they fleeing? Are they joining the rebels? Are they resisting the rebels? And so a lot of it is sort of in reaction to violence and rebels. And so I think where I'm coming in is looking at the ways that civilians, in fact, might do much more as well. And there's actually some great work that already exists in anthropology on this. Right? I have learned a lot from, for example, like Carolyn Nordstrom, as well as somebody whose name works on Mozambique. And so the anthropologists may have already gotten there before. Shocking, I know. You go to places and you learn things. But it's so I think in thinking about those places as the ways that civilians are connecting, networking, using the mobility that they have, right? And I think that's like a very interesting thing to think about, right? They could do a lot of this in a place like Turkey. They could do none of this in a place like Lebanon, right? And so how are they sort of strategically navigating this context that they're figuring out? And I think I need to like read up on what you're reading in the Caribbean. That's it. So, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Right, yeah.
My name is Sophia. I'm just undergrad in international studies. You mentioned
Yeah.
local actors in Turkey and northern Syria and what they thought of international aid and how they saw it? Like what their opinions?
So the question is, in those that are particularly in the sort of Turkish-Syrian borderland area, like how did they perceive each other? Is that the? How did the Syrians perceive internationally? That's a very interesting question, right? Because I think they really learned a lot, right? It's like trial by fire. So at the outset, right, all of this is new to them. They are not distinguishing between who's a humanitarian actor, who's a development actor. Like, what is the difference between US and UK? What is the government of Germany doing with their development agency? All of this is things that they're learning along the way. Even sort of they're learning, for example, in rebel held territory. If I work for this organization, I'm going to get this monthly salary. If I work for that organization, I'm going to get that monthly salary. And beginning to see this sort of the hierarchies and the priorities and preferences through these lived experiences, right? They're learning how, somebody recounted to me how initially at the outset he like responded to a call from an international organization with every time he submitted a funding proposal, it was rejected. But like little by little, he began to learn how should he write those proposals. I remember I speak colloquial Syrian dialect. In some of my conversations with Syrians, I would always tell them, please, Arabic is good, but let's do Arabic. But they would, it's kind of a code switching when they're getting to terms like grant proposal. They're saying that in English. Or, they're talking about the sector meetings and WASH meetings and things like this. They're using the English terms. One time I said, you're telling me the whole story in English. Why don't you just do it in Arabic? He said, well, because I'm having the memory in English because I wrote the grant proposal in English. And so they're really and they were quick to learn, right? I would meet with I met with somebody at the UN at one point, and he's like, they know all the lingo. They have talking about the Syrians, they were, that the Syrians really, they figured out how to navigate this world. Yeah, so I think that's an interesting thing to think about. Yeah. Oh yes.
So, well, I'm going to shut this out. I was wondering in times of maybe not so much conflict, but oppressive regimes, when there isn't much space for, expressing opposition. Civil society organizations also kind of organize people around some ideas and ideologies and vision. I'm kind of familiar with Eastern Europe a little bit, and so liberal principles, individual rights, etc. So I'm wondering, to what extent this was part of these groups, and did they have multi-religious or multi-religious Syria, or is it just, especially because of the needs of the conflict and destruction, was it primarily geared towards rebuilding kind of country that?
Yeah. So, Rishad, thank you for your question. I also want to say, Sophia, thank you for being an undergraduate at these kinds of seminars and asking questions. So the question being, what was the vision of these activists, at the outset? Did it change over time? Was there sort of political plans, political parties, those sorts of things? So there was a lot of disagreement, as you might imagine, in part because a lot of this was sort of starting from scratch at the ground level in a way that many of the traditional sort of the older opposition to the Assad regime had long been exiled. And there was a sort of separation between a diasporic vision of the Arab Spring in general and Syria in particular versus that of people who are on the ground, right? So there was, and this was, of course, sort of complicated by aid as well, because there are, donors and backers and supporters that might have very explicit political projects, right? And so where they're sending money and to whom is really mattering, and often causing cleavages and divisions on the ground. So let me give an example through one organization. So there was the creation of when it became clear that this is not only a political crisis, this is a humanitarian crisis, there was the idea of let's pick a Syrian group that can respond to the humanitarian crisis in a way that furthers the political goals, to say, the opposition can address the needs that have arisen from this uprising. So they created something called its Assistance Coordination Unit. Donors, the US, Gulf countries, all sort of came in and began to back their chosen factions within that unit. Meanwhile, the people on the ground who are doing the work are being sort of pulled in these conflicting directions and targeted at times for what they're representing. These people on the ground actually went on strike at one point because they were so unhappy with the ways that certain donors were trying to get their way. Right, so you can see from me telling this story where the political visions get lost, right? And where these conflicts over many sources of cleavage are lost. But at the end of the day, time and again in these situations, there are people on the ground who, many of these activists would say to me, we understand, and this kind of goes to Sophia's question, we understand that we tried to rise up for freedom and democracy, and we've ended up in a really bad situation with millions of displaced people and we feel a sort of sense of obligation that it is our duty now to address this, what has come of this. Yeah.
I'm really curious about this power dynamic that exists in the international organization. You spoke a little bit to her question and the activists on the ground. And whether there's a bi-directional relationship. So obviously the activists are benefiting from the organization because they're civilizing their work, as you said, and they might be making the revenue of it. But they have been doing good work since before these showed up. And there's also, in terms of cultural practices, for how we help one another that existed. And were those ever not accommodated, or did those ever come up against the incentives and the one-size-fits-all NGO approach to similar organizations? I'm just curious about, are you able to push back when somebody hands you a check? They're going to give you money to do this work, but you got to put my way for
Yeah. So the question is, so we can sort of see the ways that local activists may have benefited it by being able to sustain their engagement in these conflict processes with the presence of aid. But of course, were there also tensions? And as you said, this goes back to Sophia's question, which I kind of answered quite narrowly. So thinking about, was there pushback? Was there any times where people said, we have a way of doing things that we think these international actors need to listen to us? And absolutely, there was efforts at this kind of pushback. And one of the sort of key moments was when they realized, as I noted, they do a lot of needs assessment and knowledge production and data collection for international actors. And at one point, hundreds of Syrian organizations actually acted together to kind of go on strike and said, we're not going to provide data. We're going to, because you're not listening to us. So we're going to deprive you of the thing we realize now that you really need from us. And that sort of created a change in international organizations beginning to listen harder, right? But of course, international actors, they do have experiences in other conflict contexts, and they have a distinct view on things, right? And so everybody's sort of coming in, right? And I think there's times I have a paper, I know we might be up on time. I have a paper with a co-author, Emily Scott, where we actually count in one of these sector meetings. It was like the health sector that would have these monthly meetings in Beirut. And we sort of counted who was present in the meeting, and we counted who made comments in the meeting. based on the meeting notes over a couple of years. And while the local actors were always present, they almost never spoke. Right, and so there's, in some ways, there's a tokenization of, look, we have a local organizational representative at the table, right? But by looking at those meeting notes, we were able to see, like, how much does that mean impact us? Yeah.
And as we wrap up, I just want to throw out an invitation to everyone here and everyone online. If you want to read the book with me and have a little book club, shoot me an email. Maybe we do it towards the end of the quarter. Definitely something I want to do and would love to talk to y'all about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Todd will be your graduate student host. So Sophie or Sophia? Sophia, do you want to crash the graduate student pizza lunch? You should. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This is such a pleasure. Thank you and privilege. Thank you.